I thought the letter was a mistake at first. I mean, who sends official documents about an inheritance you never knew existed? But there it was, crisp and formal, with my name typed across the top and a lawyer's signature at the bottom. My husband was supposed to be handling the mail that day. He always did. But this one slipped through. When I opened it, my hand started shaking so hard I nearly dropped my coffee mug. The words blurred together, something about assets, beneficiary changes, and a name I didn't recognize. That's when I saw it. Her name. The woman who'd been calling our house at odd hours. The one he said was just a colleague. And right there in black and white, she was listed as the primary beneficiary of everything my parents had left me. Everything. I felt the walls closing in, the air getting thin. That moment, that singular, gut-wrenching moment, is where this story really begins. But to understand how I got there, I need to take you back 3 months earlier, to a time when I still believed my husband was the man I'd married 30 years ago. 3 months before that letter arrived, my life looked picture-perfect from the outside. We lived in a beautiful neighborhood in Phoenix, one of those places where the houses have terracotta roofs and the yards are full of desert landscaping. I'd worked as a school administrator for decades, and Richard had his construction business. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Or so I thought. The truth is, I'd been paying the mortgage alone for years, every single payment coming from my account. But I didn't think much of it. He said his business had ups and downs, and I believed him. I always believed him. That was my first mistake. The house itself was my pride and joy. A 3-bedroom ranch-style home with vaulted ceilings and large windows that let in the Arizona sunshine. I'd chosen every paint color, every fixture, every piece of furniture. When we first bought it, Richard had promised it would be our forever home, the place where we'd grow old together, maybe where our grandchildren would visit someday. I'd signed the mortgage papers with trembling hands, excited and terrified in equal measure. That first payment had come from our joint account. The second one, too. But somewhere around year 5, Richard's contributions just stopped. And I didn't push. I didn't demand. I just quietly transferred money every month and told myself it was temporary. Richard had this way of making his problems sound temporary. Just a few more months, he'd say. Just until this contract comes through. Just until tax season passes. I'd nod. Transfer more money, and tell myself that's what partners do. They support each other. But here's the thing about slow manipulation. You don't notice it happening until you're already trapped. It's like those stories about frogs in boiling water. The heat rises 1 degree at a time, and by the time you realize you're burning, you're too weak to jump out. I remember one specific conversation, maybe 7 years into our marriage, when I gently brought up the finances. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the mortgage statement open between us. "Richard," I'd said softly, "I noticed the payment came from my account again this month. Is everything okay with the business?" He'd looked up from his newspaper with such genuine concern that I immediately regretted asking. "Sweetheart, you know I hate that you have to worry about this," he'd said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "The Johnson contract fell through, but I've got 3 new bids out. By next month I'll be back on track. You're not worried about money, are you? Because your blood pressure." And just like that, the conversation shifted from his financial responsibility to my health anxiety. It was masterful. Really. Looking back, I can see exactly how he did it. But in that moment, I just felt guilty for adding stress to his already difficult situation. Looking back now, I can see how he used my health against me. I'd been dealing with high blood pressure and some heart palpitations for years. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to require regular monitoring and medication. Richard insisted on managing everything. He'd schedule my appointments, pick up my prescriptions, remind me when to take my pills. At first, I thought it was sweet. What loving husband wouldn't want to help his wife stay healthy? But gradually, those reminders became warnings. Don't forget your medication, or you know what could happen. You need to rest more. Stress isn't good for your heart. Maybe you shouldn't drive yourself to that appointment. What if something happens on the road? The doctor visits became particularly strange. Richard would accompany me to every appointment, sitting beside me in the examination room with his hand on my shoulder. Supportive, the nurses would say. What a devoted husband, my doctor would comment. But Richard would answer questions before I could. Describing symptoms I didn't remember having, expressing concerns about my memory that seemed to come out of nowhere. She forgot to take her medication 3 times last week, he'd say, and I'd sit there confused because I was certain I'd taken every dose. But then I'd doubt myself. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I was more forgetful than I realized. Dr. Patel, my physician of 15 years, started looking at Richard more than at me during appointments. How has she been sleeping? He'd ask Richard. Any episodes of confusion or disorientation? And Richard would sigh, heavy and concerned, and detail incidents I had no memory of. Times I'd supposedly gotten lost, driving to familiar places. Conversations I'd allegedly forgotten we'd had. It was gaslighting at its finest. And it was happening right there in a medical office, with a doctor I trusted nodding along and making notes in my chart. I know you're probably thinking, why didn't you see it? Why didn't you push back? And honestly, I ask myself that question every single day. But when you love someone, when you've built a life with them over 3 decades, you want to believe the best. You want to think that their concern is genuine, that their control is just misguided care. I had this blind spot the size of Arizona when it came to Richard. I thought if I just gave him a little more patience, a little more understanding, he'd eventually become the partner I needed him to be. My parents had raised me to be loyal. Stand by your man, my mother used to say. Marriage is work, and you don't quit just because things get hard. So I stood, and stood, and stood some more, even as the ground beneath my feet turned to quicksand. I sacrificed my dignity in ways I'm still ashamed to admit. There were times he'd criticize me in front of his friends, making jokes about my weight or my forgetfulness. I'd laugh along, pretending it didn't cut deep, convincing myself he was just being playful. Other times, he'd cancel plans I'd made with my sisters without asking me first, saying I needed to rest or that family drama would spike my blood pressure. I remember one particular incident with my sister Linda. She'd invited me to her daughter's baby shower, an event I'd been looking forward to for weeks. I'd bought the gift, wrapped it myself, picked out a new dress. The morning of the shower, I came downstairs, dressed and ready, only to find Richard on the phone in the kitchen. "I'm so sorry," he was saying, his voice dripping with regret. "She's just not feeling well today. The doctor says she needs to minimize stress, and you know how emotional these family gatherings can get." He was canceling on my behalf, without even asking me. When I protested, when I said I felt fine and wanted to go, he hung up the phone and turned to me with such manufactured concern that it still makes my stomach turn. "Honey, Linda understands. She said your health comes first. You don't want to risk having an episode in front of everyone, do you?" The shame he implied, that my presence might cause a scene, might ruin the celebration, was enough to make me nod and retreat upstairs to change. The worst part? I believed him. I actually believed that my own family was bad for my health, that seeing my sisters or old friends would somehow trigger a medical crisis. So I stayed home. I took my pills. I let him make the decisions. And slowly, without even realizing it, I became a prisoner in my own life. Have you ever doubted your own sanity? Have you ever felt like maybe everyone else is right and you're the one who's broken? That's where I was living for longer than I care to admit. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, wondering if I was being paranoid. Richard would be sleeping peacefully beside me, snoring softly, looking like the most innocent man in the world. And I'd think, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm imagining things. Those 3 a.m. moments were the worst. I'd lie there in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing, and I'd try to piece together my reality. Did I really forget that conversation he mentioned? Did I actually agree to let him handle the refinancing? Was I truly as scattered and unreliable as he suggested? The ceiling fan would rotate slowly above me, and I'd count the rotations, trying to anchor myself to something concrete, something real. 1, 2, 3, 4, breathe. 5, 6, 7, 8. You're not crazy. But the doubt would creep back in, insidious and persistent. By morning, I'd have convinced myself that Richard was right, that I was lucky to have someone so patient and caring, that I needed to try harder to be the wife he deserved. But here's what I didn't know then, what I wish someone had told me years ago. Studies show that 1 in 10 Americans over 60 experience some form of elder abuse. 1 in 10. That number haunted me when I finally learned it, because it meant I wasn't alone, wasn't crazy, wasn't imagining the cage that had been built around me. It had a name. What Richard was doing had an actual clinical term: coercive control. He wasn't hitting me, wasn't screaming at me, but he was absolutely controlling every aspect of my existence through my own fear and guilt. The weight of my sacrifices became impossible to ignore. I'd given up my book club because Richard said the late evenings were too much for me. I'd stopped going to church because he convinced me the early mornings and the stress of socializing weren't good for my heart. I'd even cut back my hours at work, moving to part-time at his insistence, which meant less income, but supposedly less stress. Except the financial pressure just shifted entirely onto my shoulders. I was working less but somehow responsible for more of our expenses. The mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, the insurance, all of it coming from my shrinking paycheck and my savings account. My boss at the school, Principal Martinez, had pulled me aside when I submitted my request to go part-time. "Are you sure about this?" he'd asked, his dark eyes filled with concern. "You're one of our best administrators. The students love you. The teachers respect you. This feels sudden." I'd given him the rehearsed explanation Richard had prepared for me: health concerns, need to slow down, doctor's orders. But Principal Martinez had known me for 12 years. He'd seen me handle budget crises, parent complaints, and administrative nightmares without breaking a sweat. He didn't look convinced. "If there's anything else going on," he'd said carefully, "anything at all, you know you can talk to me, right?" But I'd smiled and assured him everything was fine, perfect even, just prioritizing my health. The disappointment in his eyes had stayed with me for weeks. I remember one particular evening, standing in our kitchen after paying yet another round of bills. I'd just transferred $3,000 to cover the mortgage, property taxes, and Richard's truck payment. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened window above the sink, and I barely recognized the woman I saw. When had I become so small? When had my own home started feeling like a cage? The metallic taste of fear sat heavy on my tongue, and I gripped the counter until my knuckles turned white. The kitchen, which I'd renovated 5 years earlier with money from my parents' anniversary gift, suddenly felt foreign. The sage green cabinets I'd loved now seemed drab. The granite countertops, which I'd spent weeks selecting, felt cold under my hands. Everything I'd built, everything I'd carefully chosen and paid for, belonged to a version of me I could barely remember. A woman who'd had opinions, who'd made decisions, who'd believed she had agency in her own life. That night, Richard came home late, smelling like perfume I'd never worn. When I asked about it, he looked at me with such genuine confusion that I felt guilty for even bringing it up. "It's probably from one of the clients," he said. "You know how those real estate agents are, always hugging everyone." And just like that, I swallowed my suspicion and made him dinner. Because that's what good wives do, right? They trust, they believe, they sacrifice their own instincts on the altar of marital harmony. The perfume was floral, expensive, something with jasmine notes. I'd worked at a school for decades. I knew what department store perfume smelled like, what teachers wore, what was popular. This was different. This was the kind of scent a younger woman would choose, something modern and deliberate. But when I opened my mouth to say that, Richard was already moving past me, already heading to the shower, already shifting the narrative. "Long day," he called over his shoulder. "That Martinez property is a nightmare. Three-way negotiations, everyone wants something different." I probably hugged half a dozen people just trying to keep the peace. And just like that, a perfectly reasonable explanation. Except the Martinez property was a commercial build, not a residential sale. There shouldn't have been real estate agents there at all. But I didn't catch that detail until much later, until I was already piecing together the full picture of his lies. The phone calls started around that time, always late at night, always when Richard stepped outside to take them. Business, he'd say, West Coast clients working different hours, and I'd nod, take my evening medication, and try to ignore the sick feeling in my stomach. I'd tried to leave my doubts behind, to focus on the positive. We'd been married 30 years. Surely that counted for something. Surely he wouldn't throw away 3 decades of partnership for what? I didn't even want to imagine, but the calls became a pattern I couldn't ignore. 10:30 at night, like clockwork, his phone would buzz. He'd glance at the screen, his expression carefully neutral, and say something like, "Seattle contractor, has to call after his dinner meetings." Then he'd step out onto the patio, sliding the glass door closed behind him. I could see his silhouette through the curtains, pacing back and forth, his free hand gesturing animatedly. These weren't quick professional calls. They lasted 20, 30, sometimes 40 minutes. And when he came back in, there was something different about his energy, lighter, happier, more animated than he'd been with me in years. One night, I made the mistake of asking who kept calling so late. Richard had just come back inside, his cheeks flushed, a small smile playing at his lips. "Just curious," I'd said, trying to sound casual. "Seems like a lot of late-night work calls lately." The transformation was instant. His expression shifted from pleased to irritated in a heartbeat. "Are you tracking my calls now?" he'd asked. His voice sharp. "Jesus, I can't even handle my business without you questioning me? Do you know how stressful it is, trying to keep this company afloat, trying to provide for us, and you're here interrogating me like I'm some kind of criminal?" The verbal whiplash left me reeling. I'd asked one simple question, and suddenly I was the bad guy, the distrustful wife, the source of his stress. I'd apologized immediately, retreated to the bedroom, taken my medication, and hated myself for causing a problem. But the universe has a funny way of forcing you to face the truths you've been avoiding. Mine came in the form of that lawyer's letter, the one that landed in my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon in March, the one that detailed how Richard had been working to redirect my inheritance, the small fortune my parents had left me, to a woman named Jessica Moreno, the mistress I'd convinced myself didn't exist, the colleague who was supposedly just a colleague. The name on my husband's late-night phone calls. I sat on our front porch, that letter trembling in my hands, and something inside me finally cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like ice on a frozen lake, spreading fractures across a surface that had been holding too much weight for too long. My parents had died 2 years earlier, within months of each other, and they'd left me everything. Their house, their savings, their investments. It wasn't millions, but it was substantial. Enough to secure a comfortable retirement, enough to matter. My father had been a civil engineer, my mother a nurse. They'd lived modestly, saved diligently, and invested wisely. The inheritance had been a shock. I'd known they were comfortable, but I hadn't realized the extent of their financial security. When the lawyer first contacted me about the estate, Richard had been right there, attending every meeting, asking questions, taking notes. He'd seemed so supportive, so interested in making sure everything was handled properly. "We want to make sure this is protected," he'd said to the estate attorney. "This is her parents' legacy. We need to be smart about this." The lawyer had nodded approvingly, probably thinking what a caring husband Richard was. What a team we made. And Richard, my devoted husband, the man who claimed to love me, had been systematically working to steal it. Not just steal it, give it to another woman. A woman young enough to be our daughter. A woman he'd been seeing for God knows how long, while I paid our mortgage and took my pills and believed his lies about stress and health and care. The letter contained details that made my stomach turn. Attempts to have me declared mentally incompetent, forged signatures on documents I'd never seen, a carefully constructed narrative about my declining health, my unreliable memory, my need for a guardian to manage my affairs. And that guardian, according to Richard's filing, should be him. With him in control of my inheritance, he could do whatever he wanted with it, including, apparently, funneling it to his mistress. The collapse was complete when I finally let myself see the pattern. The way he'd isolated me from my sisters, claiming their visits upset me. The way he'd convinced me to put him on my accounts for emergencies. The way he'd slowly, methodically, taken control of every aspect of my medical care, my finances, my social life. Experts say that phase 2 of elder financial abuse is when the caregiver isolates the senior from family and friends. Phase 2. I'd read that in an article years ago and never thought it applied to me. But there I was, a textbook case, sitting on my porch with proof of my husband's betrayal in my lap and nowhere to turn. Except I did have somewhere to turn. I just didn't know it yet. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I drove myself to a place my sister had mentioned months earlier, a support group for people dealing with family stress and caregiving issues. I'd dismissed it then, convinced I didn't need help, convinced Richard was right about limiting my activities. But that morning, with the lawyer's letter still burning a hole in my purse, I walked through those doors and sat down in a circle of strangers. The community center was in an older part of Phoenix, a low brick building with a parking lot full of potholes and a faded sign that read, Phoenix Senior Services. Inside smelled like coffee and old books. The meeting room had fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally and folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were maybe a dozen people there, mostly women, ranging from their 50s to their 80s. Some looked tired, some looked angry. All of them looked like they understood something about suffering that the outside world couldn't see. A younger woman, maybe in her 40s, wearing a name tag that said, Facilitator, Carmen, welcomed me warmly. "First time?" she asked gently. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "You're safe here," she said, squeezing my hand. "Whatever brought you here, you're not alone." I'd heard those words before, on posters, in brochures, in well-meaning articles about domestic issues. But hearing them from someone who meant them, in a room full of people who'd lived them, hit differently. That's where I met Margaret. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair cut short and eyes that saw right through me. We were supposed to be sharing our stories, and when my turn came, I planned to say something vague and non-committal. But Margaret looked at me and said, "You don't have to lie here. Whatever's happening, we've probably seen worse." So I told them. Everything. The financial control, the medical manipulation, the isolation, the mistress, the inheritance. And instead of judgment or pity, I got recognition. Margaret had nodded through my entire story, her expression growing more grim with each detail. When I finished, when I'd run out of words and sat there shaking, she leaned forward in her chair. "My daughter did the same thing to me," she said quietly. "Different details. Same playbook. Convinced me I was losing my memory, isolated me from my friends, got herself added to all my accounts, stole $140,000 before I figured it out." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, but I could see the pain beneath it. "That was 4 years ago. I got $90,000 back, but more importantly, I got myself back. And you will too." 3 other women in that circle had similar stories, different details, same pattern. Husbands or adult children or caregivers who'd used love and concern as weapons, slowly draining bank accounts and independence while their victims smiled and nodded and believed they were being cared for. Margaret handed me a tissue and squeezed my hand. "You're not alone," she said, "and you're not crazy. But you need to move fast, because men like that don't stop until they've taken everything." She was right. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Richard had already started the process of contesting my parents' will, claiming that I wasn't mentally competent to manage the inheritance. He had documentation, doctor's notes about my blood pressure medication, records of my reduced work hours, even statements from his friends about my supposed forgetfulness and confusion. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, really. Years in the making, all building toward this moment when he could swoop in, claim I needed protection, and hand everything over to his mistress, while positioning himself as my devoted, concerned husband. The legal documents Margaret helped me obtain were chilling. Richard had prepared affidavits from 3 of his friends, all testifying to my supposed mental decline. Tom Henderson, who we'd had over for dinner maybe twice in the past year, claimed I'd repeated the same story 4 times in one evening. Steve Ramos, Richard's golf buddy, said I'd called him by the wrong name consistently and seemed confused about basic facts. Mark Chen, who'd worked with Richard on several construction projects, stated that I'd forgotten a planned lunch meeting and became agitated when he'd called to ask where I was. None of these incidents had happened, not one, but there they were, official statements, notarized and submitted to the court, building a case that I was incompetent and needed a guardian. But Margaret taught me something crucial. She taught me to document everything, every conversation, every transaction, every lie. I started keeping a journal, recording dates and times and details. I contacted my doctor directly and got copies of my medical records. Turned out my health was better than Richard had been claiming. My blood pressure was well controlled. My heart was fine. And there was absolutely no indication of cognitive decline. I pulled my credit report and discovered accounts I'd never opened, cards I'd never authorized, all in Richard's name using my credit. Dr. Patel's face when I showed up at his office alone, without Richard, was a study in surprise. "Mrs. Chen," he'd said, glancing behind me as if expecting my husband to materialize. "Is everything all right? Is Richard parking the car?" I'd smiled, a real smile, maybe the first genuine expression I'd worn in his office in years. "I'm alone today, doctor, and I need to talk to you about my medical records. I need copies of everything, all my test results, all the visit notes, everything you have on file." His expression had shifted to confusion. "Of course, but Richard usually handles all of this for you. Are you sure you want to?" "I'm absolutely sure," I'd interrupted, "and I need you to understand something. From now on, all communication about my health goes directly to me, no one else, not my husband, not anyone. I'm your patient, not him." The evidence mounted like snow before an avalanche, and somewhere in that process of gathering proof, I stopped being a victim and started being a strategist. I knew I had to plan my escape carefully, because men like Richard don't let go easily. They escalate, they threaten, they manipulate. So I played the role he expected. I took my pills, smiled at his friends, stayed home while he went out. And in secret, I met with lawyers, transferred money to accounts he didn't know about, and built my case. Margaret introduced me to her attorney, a woman named Sharon Goldstein, who specialized in elder abuse cases. Sharon was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, with a Brooklyn accent that hadn't faded despite decades in Arizona. Our first meeting was in her office, a small space in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Not fancy, but professional. She'd listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression growing darker as I spoke. When I finished, she'd set down her pen and looked me straight in the eye. "What your husband is doing is illegal on multiple levels," she'd said flatly. Identity theft, fraud, elder financial abuse, possibly forgery depending on what signatures we find. We can absolutely fight this, and we can win. But I need you to understand, this is going to get ugly. He's going to realize you're fighting back, and he's going to escalate. Men like this don't just surrender. They burn everything down rather than lose control. I'd nodded, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I understand, I'd said. I'm ready. And for the first time in 30 years, I actually was. Did you know that victims of coercive control try to leave an average of 7 times before they finally succeed? 7 times. That statistic kept me going when I wanted to give up, when the fear got too heavy, when I questioned whether I had the strength to see this through. Because I'd already tried to leave, in small ways. I'd tried to assert boundaries, tried to reconnect with my sisters, tried to question his decisions. And each time he'd pulled me back with concern and care and carefully calibrated guilt. But this time was different. This time I had proof. This time I had allies. This time I wasn't backing down. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal while my world was falling apart. Richard would come home and find me cooking dinner, smiling, asking about his day. He'd kiss my forehead and tell me about his latest project, and I'd nod in all the right places, even as I mentally catalogued another lie. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. My mind knew the truth, but my heart still wanted to believe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. That somehow, despite everything, the man I'd loved for 30 years wouldn't actually do this to me. Dinner conversations became surreal performances. "How was your day?" I'd ask, serving him pot roast, his favorite. "Exhausting," he'd sigh, accepting the plate. "The Henderson project is way over budget, and the clients are threatening to pull out. I might need to put in some of my own money to keep it afloat." Translation: he needed more of my money. "That sounds stressful," I'd say sympathetically. "Do what you need to do, honey." And he'd smile, relieved, thinking he'd successfully manipulated me once again. Meanwhile, I'd already moved half our savings to an account he didn't know about. I'd already changed the passwords on my retirement accounts. I'd already met with Sharon twice and filed preliminary documents protecting my inheritance. Every pot roast dinner, every sympathetic nod, every "yes, dear" was strategic. I was playing chess while he thought we were playing checkers, but he would, and he had. And I had to accept that the Richard I thought I married either never existed or had died long ago, replaced by this stranger who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end, a paycheck, a bank account, a stepping stone to a life with someone younger, someone who hadn't seen his worst, someone who believed his lies because she hadn't lived them yet. I almost got caught once. Richard came home early and found me on the phone with my lawyer. I'd been careless, too focused on the conversation, and I didn't hear his truck in the driveway. When I looked up, he was standing in the doorway, eyes narrowed, asking who I was talking to. My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. But then something clicked, some survival instinct I didn't know I had. I smiled and said it was my doctor's office, following up on my prescription refill. Just routine stuff. And he believed me, or pretended to. Either way, he walked away, and I made a mental note to be more careful. That close call haunted me for days. I'd been discussing legal strategy with Sharon, reviewing the affidavits Richard's friends had submitted, planning our countermotion. If he'd been 10 seconds earlier, if he'd heard even a fragment of that conversation, everything could have unraveled. I started taking my calls from my car, parked in grocery store lots or behind the community center. I started deleting my call history immediately. I started carrying my important documents in my purse at all times, never leaving them anywhere Richard might find them. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also necessary. I was living with the enemy, sharing a bed with someone actively trying to destroy me. Every moment required vigilance. The confrontation had to be public. Margaret had drilled that into me. Don't do it alone. Don't do it where he can control the narrative. So I waited for the perfect moment. Richard's mother's 80th birthday party. His whole family would be there, dozens of witnesses, people who'd known me for decades. People who'd watched me pay for their son's mistakes, cover for his failures, smile through his cruelties. Planning the revelation became my secret obsession. Margaret and I spent hours discussing the strategy. "You need maximum impact with minimum risk," she'd said. "Public enough that he can't retaliate violently, but intimate enough that his family feels the betrayal personally. His mother's party is perfect. These are people who love her, who value family loyalty. When they see what he's done to you, to his marriage, it'll hit them where they live." Sharon had been more cautious. "Make sure you have physical copies of everything," she'd warned. "Don't rely on pulling up documents on your phone. Print everything, organize it in a folder, bring multiple copies. You want this to be undeniable." I wore my best dress that day, did my hair, put on makeup. Richard complimented me on the way there, said I looked beautiful. And I smiled, knowing what was coming, knowing this was probably the last kind word he'd ever speak to me. The party was held at his sister's house, a sprawling ranch-style place with a huge backyard and too many people. I waited until everyone had gathered, until his mother had opened her presents and cut her cake. And then I stood up, my knees shaking but my voice steady, and I asked for everyone's attention. The backyard fell silent. 40-some people, all turning to look at me with expressions ranging from curious to confused. Richard's mother, Carol, smiled warmly. "Are we doing toasts?" she asked. How sweet. I smiled back at her. This woman who'd always been kind to me, who didn't deserve the bomb I was about to drop on her birthday celebration. "Something like that," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I'd practiced this moment 100 times, lying awake at night, rehearsing the words. But actually doing it, actually standing there with all those eyes on me, I'd expected to tremble. Instead, I felt calm, clear, certain. You could have heard a pin drop. I pulled out my folder, copies of the lawyer's letter, bank statements, medical records, everything I'd gathered, and I told them. Told them about the inheritance, about Jessica Moreno, about the years of financial abuse and medical manipulation. Told them how their beloved son and brother had isolated me, controlled me, and plotted to steal everything my parents had left me. Richard's face went through every shade of red and white. He tried to interrupt, tried to laugh it off, tried to paint me as confused and unstable. But I had proof, hard, undeniable proof, and his mother, bless her, looked at him with such disappointment that I actually felt sorry for him. Just for a second. "This is insane," Richard had sputtered, standing up so fast his chair tipped backward. "Mom, everyone, she's not well. This is exactly what I've been worried about. The paranoia, the confusion. She needs help." "I have a signed statement from my doctor," I'd interrupted calmly, pulling out the letter Dr. Patel had written at my request. Dated last week, confirming that I am mentally competent, in good health, and suffering from no cognitive decline whatsoever. Would you like to read it, Carol? I'd handed the paper to Richard's mother, watched her face crumble as she scanned the letterhead. The official medical assessment. The doctor's clear statement that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Richard's sister demanded he leave her house. His mother said she was ashamed. His brothers, who'd always thought I was too good for him anyway, looked ready to throw him out physically. And Jessica, poor, foolish Jessica, who thought she was getting a devoted man and a fortune. She'd been sitting in the corner the whole time, probably invited by Richard as some twisted power move. She left in tears, and honestly, I felt a little bad for her. She was just another one of his victims, really. Younger, dumber, but a victim nonetheless. Jessica had been sitting with a group of younger cousins, probably introduced as a business associate or family friend. She was beautiful in that obvious way. Long, dark hair, perfect makeup, a dress that was just slightly too form-fitting for a family birthday party. When I started speaking, when I said her name, Her face had gone pale. She'd glanced at Richard, clearly expecting him to do something, to fix this. But Richard was frozen, trapped between his lies and my truth. "I didn't know," Jessica had said suddenly, standing up, her voice shaking. "I didn't. He said you two were separated. He said the divorce was almost final. He said—" But she couldn't finish. The looks from Richard's family, the disgust and anger and betrayal, were too much. She'd grabbed her purse and run for the door, leaving Richard utterly alone. Richard tried to salvage the situation, tried to claim I was having some kind of episode, that my medication was making me paranoid. But his own mother shut him down. She'd seen the documents. She'd watched him squirm. And she'd heard enough of his lies over the years to recognize the truth when it was staring her in the face. Within a week, his whole family had turned on him. Phone calls went unreturned. Invitations stopped coming. The tight-knit Phoenix construction community he'd relied on for business started hearing whispers. His reputation crumbled faster than I could have imagined. Carol had been the one to truly break him. After the initial shock, after Jessica fled and the guests started awkwardly dispersing, she'd walked up to her son and slapped him across the face. Hard. The sound echoed across the suddenly silent yard. "I raised you better than this," she'd said, her voice shaking with rage and grief. "Your father would be ashamed. I'm ashamed. That woman," she'd pointed at me, "has been nothing but good to you. She's supported your failures, covered your debts, stood by you when no one else would. And this is how you repay her?" Richard had tried to defend himself, to explain, but Carol had held up one hand. "Don't. Just don't. I don't want to hear it. Get out of my sight." The lawyer who'd been helping him contest the will withdrew from the case immediately. Turns out, forging medical documentation and attempting to defraud an inheritance are serious ethical violations. Who knew? Jessica disappeared entirely, blocked his number, moved out of the apartment he'd been paying for with my money, and from what I heard through the grapevine, started dating some guy her own age within a month. Richard was left with nothing. No mistress, no inheritance, no family support, no reputation. Just the house we'd lived in together for 30 years, and even that was in my name because I'd been the one making the payments all along. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but mostly, I just felt tired. 30 years of marriage ended in a folder full of documents and a speech at a birthday party. It wasn't how I'd imagined my life turning out. But then again, I'd imagined a lot of things that never came true. The divorce was finalized 4 months after that birthday party. Richard contested nothing. He couldn't really, given all the evidence. I kept the house, the inheritance, my pension, everything. He got some personal belongings and the truck he'd been so proud of. His lawyer tried to argue for alimony, which was almost funny. The man who'd lived off my income for years, who'd plotted to steal my inheritance, wanted me to support him after the divorce. The judge shut that down so fast Richard's head probably spun. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s who'd probably seen every variation of marital dishonesty imaginable, had looked at Richard over her reading glasses with pure contempt. "Mr. Chen," she'd said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you are perhaps the most brazen example of financial elder abuse I've encountered in my 23 years on this bench. The documentation before me indicates a systematic, calculated effort to defraud your wife, manipulate her medical care, and steal her inheritance. You're fortunate that criminal charges haven't been filed. I will not compound your victim's suffering by ordering her to pay you 1 penny. Motion for alimony denied. This divorce is granted. We're done here." Richard's attorney had actually grimaced, clearly embarrassed to be associated with the case. I remember the day the papers were final. I sat in my living room now, not ours, and I didn't cry. I thought I would, thought I'd mourn what we'd lost. But instead, I felt light. Like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even realize was there, and suddenly, it was gone. The house felt bigger. The air felt cleaner. I could breathe. In the months that followed, I did something I never thought I'd do. I started building a chosen family. Margaret introduced me to her circle, women who'd survived their own betrayals, who understood what it meant to reclaim your life after someone tried to steal it. We met for coffee every Wednesday, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to help each other navigate the practical realities of life after abuse. They taught me things Richard had convinced me I couldn't do. How to manage my finances, how to hire contractors, how to change my own locks and program my own thermostat, and make decisions without second-guessing myself into paralysis. Our Wednesday group became sacred to me. We'd meet at a little cafe near the community center, a place with good coffee and better pastries. There was Margaret, of course, my anchor in all of this. There was Rosario, who'd escaped a financially abusive son-in-law who'd nearly bankrupted her. There was Helen, whose late husband's business partner had tried to cheat her out of her widow's settlement. And there was Patricia, the youngest of us at 54, who'd left a 20-year marriage after discovering her husband had been systematically stealing her teacher's pension contributions. We'd sit at our regular table by the window, drinking lattes and sharing stories, not just about our traumas, but about our victories. Rosario refinanced her house and got a better rate than her bank initially offered. Helen started dating again and was giddy as a teenager. Patricia went back to school for her master's degree, something she'd put off for years while her ex-husband told her she wasn't smart enough. And me? I told them about every small triumph, the day I paid my mortgage from my account without a moment of anxiety. The afternoon I spent 3 hours at a hardware store figuring out how to fix my leaky faucet myself instead of calling a plumber. The evening I booked a solo trip to Santa Fe just because I wanted to. These women celebrated every step like I'd climbed Everest, because to them, to us, these weren't small things. They were revolutions. I reconnected with my sisters, too. It was awkward at first. Years of manufactured distance don't disappear overnight. But they were patient. They understood. And slowly, the relationship we'd had before Richard isolated me started coming back. We took a trip together, just the three of us, to Sedona. Spent a weekend hiking and talking and laughing. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed like that. Real laughter, not the careful, controlled kind I'd mastered during my marriage. Linda, my oldest sister, had cried when I first called her after the divorce was finalized. Actually sobbed on the phone. I knew something was wrong, she'd said between tears. For years I knew. But every time I tried to bring it up, you'd defend him, or he'd be there listening, or you'd change the subject. I felt so helpless. I thought I was losing you. We'd both cried then, mourning the lost years, the missed celebrations, the distance Richard had created. But we'd also laughed, planning that Sedona trip, already imagining the freedom of just being sisters again without his shadow between us. I even started dating, which feels absurd to admit. I'm in my 60s, newly divorced, still processing decades of manipulation. But there's this man, Tom, who comes to the support group sometimes. He's a widower, lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, and he understands what it means to rebuild. We go to dinner sometimes, take walks, talk about everything and nothing. There's no pressure, no expectation. Just two people who've been through hell, enjoying each other's company. Tom was different from any man I'd ever known. He listened more than he talked. He asked about my opinions and actually wanted to hear them. He split checks without making it a statement about anything. He didn't try to manage my schedule or question my choices. The first time we had dinner, he'd suggested 3 different restaurants and told me to pick whichever I preferred. Such a simple thing, but I'd almost burst into tears right there. Richard had never asked my preference. Not about restaurants, not about movies, not about anything that mattered. Tom's casual respect for my agency felt like a revelation. My health improved too, which makes sense now that I'm not living in a constant state of stress. My blood pressure is better than it's been in years. I sleep through the night. I have energy for things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. Gardening, reading, volunteering at my old school. Life didn't end when my marriage did. If anything, it finally began. But before I finish this story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. Something I wish someone had taught me decades ago, before I married Richard, before I sacrificed my dignity on the altar of loyalty and love. I want to talk about how to protect yourself, really protect yourself, from the kind of abuse I endured. Because here's the truth, it can happen to anyone. It happened to me, and I was educated, employed, loved by my family. Intelligence and independence are not shields against manipulation when that manipulation is slow and patient and wrapped in the language of care. First, establish firm financial boundaries, and I mean ironclad. Never, and I mean never, let someone else have complete control over your money, your accounts, or your assets. I don't care how much you love them or how long you've been together. Keep at least one account in your name only. Know where every penny goes. Review your credit report annually. If someone pressures you to sign documents without reading them, that's a red flag the size of Texas. If they insist on managing all your finances for your own good, that's not love, that's control. Second, protect your medical autonomy. Your health information is private, protected by law. And nobody, not your spouse, not your children, not anyone, should be managing your health care without your explicit, informed consent. Go to your own doctor appointments. Pick up your own prescriptions when you're able. Make sure your physician has your direct contact information, not just your caregivers. I learned too late that Richard had been intercepting calls from my doctor's office, editing the message before passing it on to me. He'd convinced my doctor that I was forgetful, that I needed him to manage my care, and I never questioned it until it was almost too late. Third, maintain your relationships independently. This is crucial. If someone in your life starts isolating you from family and friends, through guilt, through concern for your health, through scheduling conflicts that always seem to arise, stop and ask yourself why. Real love doesn't require isolation. Real care doesn't demand you cut ties with the people who've known you longest. Richard spent years slowly separating me from my sisters, my friends, my community. And he did it so gradually, so carefully, that I didn't realize I was alone until I desperately needed help and had nowhere to turn. Know the warning signs of financial elder abuse. According to the National Council on Aging, these include sudden changes in bank accounts or banking practices, unauthorized withdrawal of funds, abrupt changes in a will or other financial documents, unexplained disappearance of funds or valuable possessions, and substandard care or unpaid bills despite adequate financial resources. I experienced every single one of those, and I still didn't see it. Because the abuse came from someone I trusted, someone who claimed to love me, someone who'd spent decades building my dependence on him. Here's something else I learned. Coercive control leaves scars, just like physical abuse does. Maybe you can't see them, but they're there. I'm in therapy now, working through 3 decades of gaslighting and manipulation. Some days are harder than others. I still catch myself second-guessing decisions, still hear Richard's voice in my head telling me I'm not capable, not smart enough, not healthy enough. But I'm learning to recognize those thoughts for what they are, echoes of his abuse, not reflections of my truth. My therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, uses this technique she calls reality testing. When I hear Richard's voice in my head, when that critical, doubting narrative starts, I'm supposed to stop and ask myself, is this objectively true? What evidence supports this thought? What evidence contradicts it? It sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. That voice that says, I can't manage money. I've been managing my finances flawlessly for 2 years since the divorce. That voice that says I'm too forgetful. I've never missed an appointment, never forgotten to pay a bill, never lost track of anything important. That voice that says I'm not healthy enough to live independently. My blood pressure is normal, my heart is strong, and I hiked 5 miles in Sedona without breaking a sweat. Reality contradicts Richard's narrative at every turn. But unlearning 3 decades of conditioning takes time. And I want to say this directly to anyone who might be in a situation like mine was. You are not crazy. You are not imagining things. If your gut tells you something is wrong, trust it. Your instincts are there for a reason, and dismissing them, or worse, having someone else dismiss them for you, is dangerous. I spent years doubting myself, years believing that my concerns were symptoms of instability rather than responses to real manipulation. Don't make that mistake. trust yourself. You know your life better than anyone else, and you deserve to be heard, believed, and protected. Also, document everything. I cannot stress this enough. Keep records of financial transactions, medical appointments, conversations, everything. Store copies somewhere safe, somewhere your potential abuser can't access. Email them to yourself. Save them to a cloud account. Give them to a trusted friend. That documentation was what saved me. Without it, Richard's version of events, that I was unstable, forgetful, incapable, would have prevailed. Paper trails don't lie, and they don't forget. If you suspect elder abuse is happening to someone you love, speak up. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't convince yourself it's none of your business. My sisters suspected something was wrong for years, but they didn't want to interfere in my marriage, didn't want to upset me by suggesting my husband was anything less than devoted. By the time they felt comfortable saying something, I was so isolated and convinced of my own incompetence that I dismissed their concerns. Early intervention matters. A single conversation, a single offer of support, might be exactly what someone needs to recognize their situation and seek help. Learn your legal rights. I had no idea that what Richard was doing constituted elder abuse until Margaret explained it to me. I had no idea that coercive control, even without physical violence, could be grounds for legal action. I had no idea that attempting to fraudulently obtain someone's inheritance was a crime. Ignorance doesn't protect you. Knowledge does. Research the laws in your state. Understand what constitutes financial exploitation, medical abuse, and emotional manipulation. Know what resources are available, from legal aid to adult protective services to support groups. And finally, please know that it's never too late to leave. I was 63 when I finally stood up to Richard. 63? Married for 3 decades, convinced that my age and my health made me powerless. But I was wrong. You are never too old, never too sick, never too far into a relationship to reclaim your autonomy. It's terrifying. Yes, it's exhausting. There were days I wanted to give up, days the fight seemed harder than just surrendering. But freedom, real, genuine freedom, is worth every difficult moment. The cost of silence is too high. I know that now. Every day I stayed quiet. Every time I accepted Richard's explanation instead of demanding the truth, I was teaching him that he could continue. I was showing him that I would tolerate the intolerable, that my boundaries were negotiable, that my dignity was expendable. Silence protects abusers. Speaking up protects victims. So speak. Scream if you have to. Tell your story to anyone who will listen. Break the shame that keeps these things hidden. One more thing. If the system fails you, and sometimes it does, don't give up. Not every judge understands coercive control. Not every lawyer takes elder abuse seriously. Not every family member will believe you. I was lucky. My evidence was solid. My judge was informed. Richard's family saw the truth. But even if some of those pieces had fallen differently, I would have kept fighting. Because the alternative, going back to that life, to that prison of concern and care and control, was not an option. Find advocates. Find support groups. Find people who understand. They exist and they will help you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. I know it was long. I know it was heavy. But these are the truths we need to tell. These are the stories that might save someone else from losing 30 years of their life to a lie. If you connected with any part of what I shared today, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are. Let me know you're out there, that these words found you, that maybe they helped in some small way. And if you found value in this story, please consider leaving a like. It helps more people find this content. And the more people who hear these warnings, the fewer victims there will be. Subscribe if you want to hear more real stories like this one. Stories of survival, of reclamation, of women who refuse to disappear quietly into someone else's narrative. I want to ask you something too, something I've been wondering. What would you have done in my place? When you found that letter, when you discovered the betrayal, would you have confronted him privately or publicly like I did. Do you think the public exposure was too harsh, or was it the only way to protect myself? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, about whether I handled this the right way, or if there was something I should have done differently. Before you go, I want to suggest a couple of other videos you might find helpful. There's one about recognizing financial red flags in relationships, and another about rebuilding your life after divorce at any age. Both share stories from women who've walked this path before you, who've survived and thrived despite everything. And listen, if you're going through something similar right now, if you're sitting there wondering if your situation counts as abuse, or if you're overreacting, please reach out. To someone. To anyone. To me, if you need to. You don't have to be perfect to deserve better. You don't have to wait until the situation becomes unbearable to ask for help. You matter. Your safety matters. Your happiness matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Until the next story, take care of your heart. Protect it fiercely, love it completely, and never, ever let anyone use your capacity for love as a weapon against you. You deserve a life built on honesty, respect, and genuine care.